This is Jack Gerard, the CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, visiting the Palm Beach Post editorial board. Good morning, Mr. Gerard.
Good morning. Thank you for having me today.
Thank you for coming. We'll just start in with what I'm sure is on most people's minds. Would you care to address why there has been such a significant run-up in gas prices since the end of last year?
Yeah, the price of gasoline is by and large determined by the cost of crude oil. And I think, as you know, the value of crude oil is set on a global marketplace. There are a lot of factors that contribute to the price of crude oil, many of which we don't have any control over here in the United States, but one of which we do. Those that we really don't have much control over are the demand in places like China, India, Brazil, and some of the emerging markets, the value of the dollar to some extent, but also the unrest that we see in North Africa and the Middle East right now with a lot that's gone on over there. But the one place we do have control is the amount of supply we as Americans put into that marketplace that helps set that price of crude. And that's where we think we can do much better as a country. We believe we can produce more American oil and natural gas by Americans for Americans, which gives us a triple win in our mind. First, it creates hundreds of thousands of new jobs. Economic analysis shows if given the opportunity to produce America's oil and natural gas, we could generate over 500,000 new American jobs. Coupled with that would be a $150 billion contribution. This is an increase over what we pay today, $150 billion increase in federal revenue to the federal treasury. And the third part that we believe is significant and important, it provides more energy security for us as a nation. So we are less influenced, if you will, by those global demand factors, the unrest in the Middle East, etc., that tend to impact that price of crude, which translated down impacts the price of gasoline at the pump. So that's the situation that we're dealing with today. We believe we should be more aggressive as a nation in producing our own energy, providing additional supply to that marketplace, because fundamentally it all boils down to the simple laws of economics of supply and demand. So that's why we're seeing that run-up.
Over what kind of time frame are you talking about in terms of these 500,000 new jobs?
Well, the economic report estimates between 2030 and 2035 we could create 500,000 new jobs. But when you look at the marketplace today, clearly it would make a significant contribution to a national unemployment rate of 9.1%. Here in Florida, as you know, you're fourth highest in the country at about 11%. Part of our analysis shows that over 200,000 of those jobs could be created here in Florida. These are well-paying jobs. These are critical to our basic economy, the energy foundation building blocks that supply the economy of the nation.
Do you mean if in Florida, if there were drilling in state waters?
Well,
where would those jobs come from?
Gulf of Mexico, Atlantic. When you look at the United States today, about 85% of our outer continental shelf, the eastern Gulf, around on the Atlantic, the Pacific, and major parts of Alaska, are off limits as a result of government policy. It's been the policy for many years in this country until the moratorium was lifted a few years ago. But the Obama administration has reimposed those restrictions or those limitations.
Well, no,
so if given,
if
given an opportunity to develop those resources, that's where you could create that at least 500,000 jobs. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Well, but the moratorium that was imposed after the BP spill has ended.
The moratorium in the Gulf that was imposed by the administration has ended.
Right.
But the administration also has not put forward a 5-year plan, which is under their purview and their control, as to what areas will be developed in the future. In fact, in the past, they have announced that none of those areas will be developed. It was only recently, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, when the President suggested we need to produce more of America's oil and gas. But we are yet to see any policy decisions or pronouncements that would allow those areas that are off limits to be put back on limits for development purposes.
There was, yesterday, I believe, ExxonMobil announced the discovery of 3 large fields in the Gulf of Mexico in fairly deep water that they think have a lot of potential. We'd like to talk about the safety issues from offshore drilling after the BP spill. There is a report that a consortium of oil companies has devised new safety rules. Would you like to discuss those?
Well, absolutely, Ray. A couple things. First is the discovery by ExxonMobil in the Gulf yesterday, or the announced discovery. Great news for America. That's job creation, that's energy security, that's additional revenue to the federal government. We pay, or I should say they paid, for the right to look on that lease. So they had to pay to go out and look in that area we call a lease. They pay every year to hold that lease, and now that they've discovered oil and natural gas, they'll pay a percentage of that to produce it, all of which goes back to government revenues, to government coffers, something we need dramatically at this point.
Safety issue is what we're trying to get at.
Let me tell you, following the tragic event in the Gulf last year, the industry moved very quickly to look closely at our safety practices, our standards, and what we can do to make sure we're operating at the highest levels of performance. We organized 4 what we called our joint industry task forces. Within the first 30 days, made strong recommendations to the administration, many of which were adopted in their first report. You might remember back when the President said he wanted a report from the Secretary of Energy. Many of our recommendations to them were adopted and put forward. We looked at our equipment, we looked at our personnel, we looked at containment, and we looked at oil spill response. We brought the best minds in the world together. As a result of that, 4 of our largest companies, and this might be what you're referring to, came together and created the Marine Well Containment Corporation. They committed over $1 billion to develop a state-of-the-art containment system that could be used in the future if we ever had another similar tragic event, which we hope not only will never happen again, but this system will never have to be used. In addition to that, there's been other consortiums to come together, a group called Helix, one of the companies, which has 24 other companies that came together and developed a similar process. But the important part of that is the industry came together, and we've just announced a few months ago, we've created the Center for Offshore Safety. And what we're going to do with this center, it has independent components to it, so we have third-party auditors. We're certified by independent entities that come in and say, yes, these processes are transparent. Yes, this process develops a best practice, a safety standard that will encourage the entire industry to elevate their continued performance.
Why did the industry oppose in 2003 the remote control backup blowout preventer?
Well, I wasn't with the industry in 2003,
okay,
and
you are now, so
I am today.
Doesn't that look sort of stupid in retrospect?
Well, I don't think so, Randy. The reason I don't think so is there's conflicting study and analysis done on those remote control efforts. Some have said in the early days of the spill, some said, well, we ought to do what the Norwegians are doing in the North Sea. But if you look at the data suggests it was conflicting, and it wasn't absolutely clear that those are the answer.
But Norway requires that device.
Well, I'm not sure exactly what Norway does with that. There's some confusion.
Brazil and Norway require a remote control backup blowout preventer. The blowout preventer that a backup to the blowout preventer that failed at the Deepwater Horizon rig, and cost I think was $500,000. The federal government proposed that in 2003. The industry said no, it's too expensive.
Well, the industry said no for a couple reasons. Cost may have been one consideration, but not the only consideration.
Okay.
There was some concern that the ability to communicate with those systems down below could fail. And that was part of the reason the industry came in and said, we need to look at this more closely and make sure that when we come up with a solution, it's a right solution and the solution really works.
Didn't the industry say that the system that was in place last year would have been sufficient? No, wasn't it saying when deep water drilling began in earnest that there are enough safety systems in place to prevent what happened in April 2010?
Well, let's go back and let's look at the context in which the tragic spill in the Gulf occurred. We've been operating in the Gulf of Mexico for 65 years. We've drilled 42,000 wells in the Gulf of Mexico. The first time anything of this magnitude has ever happened. It was tragic. It needed to be addressed. The industry's moved very quickly to address this question, to put other safeguards in place as we move forward. So whatever the past dialogue has been, We see this as our responsibility as an industry. We've stepped up to the table. We have supported additional regulators at the Department of Interior. We've actually sent letters to the Congress saying adequately fund the department to make sure they have sufficient oversight of this industry. They've got adequate, well-trained people who are sophisticated in oil and gas development, so we have a robust regulator. So we're headed absolutely in the right direction. We see that as our responsibility, and we're moving ahead aggressively and quickly.
Back to gas prices for a moment. Can you
Yes.
just, they are coming down a little bit, 1.5 cents this week compared to last week. What can you tell our readers about what you project in terms of gas prices in the near future?
Well, within the American Petroleum Institute, for antitrust reasons, we don't project the price of gasoline. But I'll tell you, reading what other third parties say, what other economic experts say, those factors I mentioned earlier will clearly contribute to where that price might be because it impacts the price of crude oil. You saw the announcement yesterday by OPEC, for example. That will play into that. The economic recovery, unfortunately, the most recent data suggests we're beginning to stall, something none of us want to see. But that also will bring some downward pressure because those that are looking to the future to say, what will the cost of crude oil be in the future, will say, well, there might be less demand because the economy is not recovering as quickly as we'd like it to be. But again, I'd remind us all, it's complicated in that there are a lot of variables that contribute to it, but it fundamentally is pretty simple. It's the law of supply and demand, and it's dictated by and large the cost of crude oil. The other factor we shouldn't overlook, and this was a big one in the state of Florida as well, the second costliest component of the price of gasoline is taxation at the pump. Your tax down here in Florida is 52 cents a gallon. That's one of the higher ones in the nation. But you put those two components together, the price of crude oil and the cost of the income tax, and that's 3/4 or more the cost, the price of gasoline, long before you get into the cost we have to incur to ship it, to refine it, to transport it, and then to put it at the local gas pump.
You're suggesting they should lower the gas taxes?
No, I'm not. We've never really taken a position on the gas tax issue. Obviously, there's a lot of issues that contribute to that, such as road building, infrastructure issues. So we've kind of left that off the side. We just encourage them when they impose that cost on the price of gasoline that they use it for infrastructure reasons as opposed to just general revenues. Other than that, we believe that's within the province, obviously at federal and state governments. That's really a decision they need to make based on what they think is in the best interest of their constituents.
Higher gas taxes just to reduce consumption and encourage alternative energy?
Well, I think the policy there really gets back to the fundamentals of what we want the energy equation to look like in the United States. It might surprise you to know from 2000 to 2008, the oil and natural gas industry invested $58 billion in the development of zero carbon emitting and low carbon emitting technologies. Now that $58 billion in that time span is more than the entire federal government invested and more than the rest of the private sector invested. And the reason I raise that is we see ourselves as energy companies. Our primary role today is oil and natural gas because 61% of all the fuel we use in the United States is oil and natural gas. So it's going to be with us for a long time to come. But we also recognize the need to identify new and alternative forms of energy. So whatever the government policy is that would come back and determine what that appropriate mix is, it's got to be a mix. We need to look at all the sources. Again, we emphasize oil and natural gas because not only is it 61% of the energy we use today, but the Obama administration Department of Energy economists say by 2035 it will still be 55% of the energy we consume in this country, and that's if we can achieve a 200% increase in renewables and alternative forms, something which is a pretty aggressive change. So we support the alternative energies. We're the big investors in those alternative energies. We just have to be realistic to what it takes to run this economy and what it will take to run it for decades to come.
I want to go back to jobs for just a second.
Please.
You said all those jobs, but then you said 2030 to 2035. That's a long time in the future.
Well, if
And then you implied that it would help Florida now, or it would help us in this terrible economy we have, but I don't see that.
don't see what?
Producing jobs quickly.
Oh, no. We would begin to produce those jobs quickly, but by the time you get to 500,000, you'd be in the 2030, 2035 range. Don't misunderstand what I'm saying. Give us opportunity to produce oil and natural gas in this country, there'll be jobs brought online almost immediately. When you get the real value, the real jump up to 500,000 new jobs from just oil and gas development, it will take you a few years. You got to think about the process. It takes years to go in to identify the resource, years to develop the resource. A lot of our wait time there is government permitting. We have to wait for Uncle Sam to give us the go-ahead once we go out and develop a well, design the infrastructure, and then bring it all on board.
But you're not implying that's a bad thing.
No, it's a very positive thing. I believe any job created today in the United States of America is a good thing.
I mean,
The permitting was what he was talking about.
Permitting should be far more efficient than it is. We've seen significant delays in the Gulf, particularly as a result of the unfortunate moratorium in the Gulf. We think that was unnecessary. You can focus on safety. You can achieve those standards or achieve safe performance without unnecessarily, arbitrarily just shutting down the entire industry.
Well, it was hardly arbitrary. Your industry made claims about safety that were exposed to be false, not just by the spill itself, but by the Graham-Riley Commission that looked at the spill. It basically concluded it was preventable, that the industry had moved to undercut the Minerals Management Service, had opposed and lobbied against most safety regulations.
Well, I think
what do you think of the industry's
first of all, we
there?
take strong issue with some of the things that came out of that approach where they suggested systematic failure in the industry. That's not founded in the facts, and it's not founded in the research done in the report. If you go back and you read that report in detail, you'll find that there's nothing there to support that conclusion. Number two, the industry's been the leader in the safety performance of this industry for many years. The American Petroleum Institute was originally established as a standard-setting organization. We've been setting standard and promoting best practices for 90 years in this country.
Are you saying then that you are distancing API from what BP did?
No, I'm not saying that at all, Randy. Listen to me. What I'm saying is, let's go back and look at the facts of the situation. The standards we set in industry are the best in the world, and the best practices are adopted by many regulators. You might not be aware that after the spill response in the Gulf of Mexico, the Department of Interior looked very closely at safety practices to change the regulatory body, and guess what they did? They came back and adopted the API best practice on safety standards, on what we call SEMS, Safety Environment Management Practices, and they adopted that as a legal requirement moving forward. So we're pushing those standards. We encourage regulators to adopt them as the best practices, and in this particular case, that was the answer.
If they're so good,
so we're leading that.
If they're so good, why did the BP spill happen?
Let's put this in context again, Randy. We've been out there for 65 years. I wished I could control...
That's not what I'm asking about.
Let me respond to you.
I'm taking your comment about best in the world, then how did it happen when the industry basically said, this can happen?
Well, you're suggesting there's no risk involved with the development of oil and natural gas or anything else.
Excuse me, I'm not suggesting that. I'm suggesting that the record of BP, as uncovered by the Commission and by many news reports, was of trying to get around as many of these safety precautions as possible. And you're saying that API standards were adopted. Well, if they're so good, how did this spill happen?
Well, again, you're suggesting that it's perfect that there's no risk involved. There's risk in everything we do. There's potential for challenges in any entity producing any form of energy. We were in the Gulf for 65 years, drilled 42,000 wells, as I mentioned to you earlier. First time ever anything of this nature's happened. We recognize it's our responsibility.
Big one for the first
It
time.
was a significant tragic incident, there's no doubt about it, but we've taken steps quickly, we've moved aggressively to address what we've learned from this spill and taken best practices and moving it forward.
Give us one specific that you think has been enacted since then that would have prevented the spill.
Well, if you look back at what the regulators have done, they've changed the safety management practices, they've changed a lot of the regulatory regimes. Within the industry, we've come up with new best practices. Just recently, we've come out with a new well-designed standard for the entire industry based on what we've learned as a result of the spill. So again, we're taking very aggressive action, aggressive steps to learn from this tragic incident and to elevate the entire industry's performance into the future.
You said that the industry between 2000 and 2008 had invested $58 billion in alternative energy. The profits for the top 5 in the first quarter of this year were $35 billion, as the figure was reported. So maybe that figure isn't so great compared to your profits. And speaking of profits, we just had the debate in the Congress about tax breaks for the industry. Why shouldn't Congress take about $2 billion a year from the top 5 biggest oil companies and apply that to the deficit?
Well, you got a lot of questions in there. Let me try to address them, and then let's make sure I don't overlook something here. First is your comment, I think, about the investment in alternative and renewable forms of energy. In that period of time that I mentioned to you, 2000 to 2008, we led the entire nation. This industry invested more than the entire federal government combined, long before we had a very intense debate about these alternative renewable forms of energy. So we're the leaders in that area. Now let me go back and talk about the earnings question. One thing that's important to remember, a lot of people focus only on the level of earnings, but you need to understand those earnings in the context of the size of these companies. These are very large companies. The reason they are large is because they compete on a global basis, and their primary competition are national oil companies, what we call NOCs, which are foreign governments. They compete with the government of Venezuela, the government of Saudi Arabia, Russia, China, the list goes on. And so when you look at those numbers, you have to remember, as a relative return, those numbers, believe it or not, aren't that significant. And what I mean by that, when you look at it on the basis of a dollar of sales, the average Dow Jones company earns about 12 cents per dollar of sales. The oil and natural gas industry earns 8 cents per dollar of sale, less than the average of all the other companies. So that's the first thing to remember. The second thing, which is really most important, is who owns oil and natural gas. A lot of the political theater and rhetoric surrounding this debate suggests that somehow corporate management owns these companies. Nothing's further from the truth. Less than 2% of oil and natural gas stocks or shares are owned by corporate management.
I don't think that's been a big issue in the debate over taxes. The big issue...
Well, no, let me finish the comment, because it absolutely should be a big part of the debate over taxes. Let me tell you why. 98.5% of all oil and gas shares are owned by 401k plans, public pension plans, and mutual funds, and the list goes on. Now, what does that mean? That means when you take those earnings that are typically returned to the shareholder, and you start arbitrarily just taking a piece of those earnings merely because they happen to be in a big number and for no other reason, who you're impacting are the shareholders, those retirees who live in Florida, who live elsewhere in this country, who have invested in oil and natural gas companies for their retirement and saving for the future. That's who gets impacted by this policy. So let's not be confused about somehow, well, we're going to go punish oil companies, we're going to punish corporate management by taking a piece of their earnings.
I don't think punishment is the issue.
Well, that's what some of the rhetoric is in Washington.
The issue is that we are in a terrible debt situation.
Okay.
Your companies are very profitable. $35 billion in the first quarter for the top 5 is pretty good, even if you want to poor mouth that. And they're talking about taking $2 billion a year and shifting that to our tax burden and reducing the deficit. Why is that a bad? Would it have any impact on the price of gas? Would it stop you from exploring if you had to pay those taxes? Why not do that?
Well, there are multiple reasons. There's multiple reasons, and let me tell you what those are. First of all, it's poor tax policy. Does that suggest any time an American company has a good quarter that we just go out and take our piece off the top because government can't discipline itself, get its deficit and debts under control? That's terrible public policy. The second piece, let me finish.
No. The tax policy here is not, they're really rich, let's take their money. The tax policy here is, we think that they're getting tax breaks for things that are no longer serving our interest because they would do the exploration regardless. They're taking tax breaks for foreign taxes and royalties that they pay. They're taking a tax break by refusing to return, they're putting their money on the books of the American corporations. These are tax breaks.
Okay,
what policy does it serve to do that?
Well, let me address that in a couple different ways, and here's one that'll hit home here with the paper, and this will make good common sense, I think. First of all, tax policy should provide clarity and certainty as to what the rules of the game are. Because if you don't have clarity and you don't have certainty, you will discourage the investment in the United States. I believe, and I hope all other Americans, I believe they do believe, that we should do everything we can to encourage the development here in the United States. So that's the first point. The second point, all the provisions that are being talked about right now, oftentimes you hear the word, well, corporate subsidies, the oil and gas industry. The oil and natural gas industry receives no subsidies in the United States as a result of tax law. What you're talking about are provisions of cost recovery. One case in point that probably impacts your newspaper, there's what they call Section 199, the manufacturing deduction. This provision was passed in 2004 as a job creation measure to create American jobs and to retain jobs here in the United States. This provision applies to all industries. The tax policy being proposed in Washington is to identify 5 oil and gas companies, which happen to be the largest companies in the oil and gas sector, to discriminate against them and to deny them that deduction that the rest of the community, the business community, gets to offset the costs that they produce. But let me go back, let me finish the comment.
But the others are specific.
That manufacturing deduction also applies to newspapers such as your own, to General Electric, to Microsoft and others. So we need to be thoughtful about the policies we're imposing. If we're attempting to punish one sector that impacts their ability to create American jobs and produce American energy, that's poor tax policy.
The others apply only to your industry, though.
No, that's not true.
Who else has depletion and drilling recovery costs? Who else?
All the other basic industries, such as in percentage depletion, the coal mining industry, the mining sector, all those extractive industries have similar provisions.
They're not nearly as broad.
Well, that's just not true. That's just not true.
Nearly as broad as the manufacturing one that you're holding up as the poster child.
No. Well, the 199 applies to all corporations and all business interests, including newspapers and others.
That's the only one of the tax breaks that does.
That's not true. The dual capacity provision, which is a credit for taxes that you pay in overseas operations, why would we want to double tax American companies? Why would we want to say you pay taxes in this nation on your operations over there, but if you bring it home to invest in America or to pay your American workers, we're going to double tax you? That's poor tax policy. That applies to high-tech industries, it applies to the oil and gas industry, it applies to General Electric, it applies to all across the board. So we need to make sure we get our facts right so we don't continue to perpetuate myths about what this political theater discussion is all about.
Are you suggesting that if these tax breaks had gone away, if the filibuster had not stopped and then the House by some miracle had passed it, that the oil fields that the discovery was announced yesterday, that those wouldn't be developed, that there wouldn't be enough money in those without the tax breaks for the oil industry to go ahead and develop those as quickly as they possibly can?
When you raise the cost of doing business in the United States, you're going to further discourage investment in the United States.
They wouldn't go and tap this rich resource because they have to pay a little bit more in taxes?
These companies are global.
Yeah.
They're being recruited by everybody in the world to invest those dollars into those resources wherever they may be around the world.
So just to be clear, you're saying they would not go as aggressively
let me finish my
after
comment.
that resource.
If you increase the cost of doing business in the United States, you will discourage the investment in the United States in relationship to other opportunities around the globe. I think that's poor American tax policy. I think we should do everything we can to encourage particularly American companies to invest in America. And tax policy that penalizes companies who happen to have one good quarter of earnings is poor tax policy, and it doesn't make sense.
When was the last bad quarter you had?
Over the past 2 or 3 years. When oil drops down to $30 and $40 a barrel, do you hear anybody clamoring to come forward and say, well, gee, we ought to take care of the oil and gas here? I don't think so. These companies are well run. The leaders of these companies have to figure out as we go through these cycles, just like the cycles we have in the gasoline prices. One of the CEOs in testifying at the tax hearing commented that his refining business had lost money 5 out of the last 8 quarters. Now, why would we want to punish or penalize a company like that? Let's go figure out ways to incentivize them to invest in America. Now, there's a fundamental choice here. Let me make this comment, and I'm happy to have further questions. Right now, the debate is around taxes or access. Economic analysis shows if you go down the tax road and you start putting additional costs on the oil and gas industry, you will lose billions of dollars ultimately to the federal treasury, and it will cost you 128,000 American jobs. That's that alternative. The opposite, or the alternative to that approach, is to provide additional access. The same economic analysis shows if you provide access here in the United States, you'd generate over $150 billion in new revenue to the federal treasury, and this goes back to the 2030 discussion about creating 500,000 jobs. That's American energy, produced by Americans for Americans' consumption.
And whose analysis is that?
It's done by Woods Mackenzie, which is a consulting firm.
Paid by you?
Sure, we do a lot of analysis, absolutely.
Okay, Andrew?
I had some questions about, general questions about climate change.
Please.
Does API have a perspective on the gravity of climate change first of all, and the effect of carbon emissions on that?
We represent a diverse group of companies, obviously, and they range in their views on the climate. We strongly oppose the Waxman-Markey approach that came out of the House of Representatives, but we have some companies that were very aggressively part of the climate action group in Washington that you've probably heard so much about, that was promoting a lot of climate law, and others who think we need to step back, particularly in light of this economic downturn, and rethink, if you will, some of those climate policies. So our membership's pretty diverse on that, and don't really have a real clear consensus as to what they would all like to do in that area.
At some point, cap and trade will probably come back up in the national discussion. Where's API on that? Is that a helpful, is that a beneficial proposal?
Well, we have some of our members who've strongly supported cap and trade approaches, believe that's the best way to address the climate issue. We have others that have been very vocal on a carbon tax, that said if you're going to address the carbon issue, the best way to do it is just be transparent, just put a cost on it. And so again, we kind of span that continuum, if you will, of some thinking cap and trade's a better approach and some thinking carbon tax is a better approach.
What are the pros and cons there?
Well, and a carbon tax approach is probably less costly and more efficient in terms of actually the consumer knowing what the cost is, who pays that cost, and how that revenue is generated or redistributed. In a cap and trade approach, it has the potential to be very complicated and potentially create some unfortunate outcomes. That's why some of our folks support just a plain carbon tax that say what's the cost that changes the behavior of energy consumption, and put that cost on it and just let the public know that's the costs they're going to be paying. And others think you put market mechanisms in place and therefore you can adjust. Keep in mind that cap and trade approach applies to a lot of different sectors, not just ours. We're kind of the mobile emissions source, or the vehicle piece, but a huge amount of those come from the stationary sources, generation of electricity, for consumers, and then you get an industrial piece in the middle. So we're just one piece of that, and some believe through a cap and trade approach you could balance those different pieces out.
Do those things discourage consumption? Is that a bad thing?
Well, so different people argue that differently. Some believe it's much like the gas tax argument. If you increase the cost of fuel enough, it clearly has an impact on consumption. You see this even in the price of gasoline. In 2008, when the price unfortunately rose to where it rose around the $4 range, you started to see less consumption. It had a direct impact. You started to see more buying of more fuel-efficient cars. And that debate continues, and that's an important debate. We need to have it in this country and figure out how we balance those various interests.
Do you personally believe that the burning of fossil fuel causes the earth to warm?
Randy, I'm not sure I'm smart enough to answer that question. I'm not a scientist. I don't have background there. I've read a lot of the literature. There are a lot of folks who believe that the fossil fuel contribution is significant in terms of CO2 emissions and its impact. And there are others out there who see it differently.
But what do you disbelieve it?
I've never taken a personal view on that. I represent my members, and right now they have some differing views, and we try all the times to come together on consensus, and on this one we have some diversity of opinion.
Okay, then if you have diversity of opinion, why 2 years ago did you organize what amounted to staged, quote, citizen rallies against the cap and trade bill?
We took a strong position against the Waxman-Markey bill in the House because it would have cost millions of jobs in the United States, and we believe would have driven the price of gasoline over $5 a gallon. We don't think that's good public policy. We don't think that was in the best interest.
What about the events you organized? Is that honest? Because you were, the memo that the Guardian newspaper reported that you wrote said basically we're going to go and make these look like they're grassroots events, and we're going to pay for them.
That's just not true. Let me correct that record if I can. I'm not sure what you're reading or what you're surmising from.
I'm reading the story in the memo that's quoting you.
And what's my direct quote?
A sensitive plan to stage events during the congressional recess. We need to move aggressively. You cited polls to test the effectiveness of the arguments against climate change legislation and offered up citizen energy rallies. API will provide the upfront resources. This includes contracting with a highly experienced events management company that has produced successful rallies for presidential campaigns.
Absolutely. We strongly encourage that today, and we'll do everything we can to engage the American people in this dialogue. One of the things we've done since I've come to the API is we've been more aggressive, if you will, in reaching out and interacting and educating the public at large. And those are absolutely very appropriate activities.
Well, are you educating the public if you're essentially passing off a rally as organized by local people when you're paying for it?
Don't read into that something that doesn't exist. First of all,
I'm trying to find out from you what does exist.
Well, when we had a Houston rally, for example, there were multiple sponsors, farm bureaus, local manufacturers, small businesses, the African American Chamber of Commerce, and the list goes on. These are just not our views. What we're encouraging is a robust public policy debate. We believe the best policy in this country, be it at the state level or the federal level, will be created by engaging the citizenry of the United States in that dialogue and that discourse. So we go out and encourage our views to be heard. If people disagree with those, which some do, they share their views. We think that's how you integrate and get the American people engaged in the process. So yes, we have not only held those rallies, we held some again last year on job creation potential opportunities in the oil and gas sector. We held one at the Pipe Fitters Union operation outside of Chicago. We work closely with organized labor and others in our job creation efforts in the oil and gas industry.
Okay, well then just, this is not the Guardian quoting anybody, this is directly your statement from 2 years ago, May of 2009, where critical of the Waxman-Markey bill, and you say, quote, we need to look at all the consequences of the bill, consider the implications on ordinary Americans at a time of economic hardship, and come up with an equitable plan that will address global climate change and improve, not weaken, our nation's energy and economic security. So what do you think is an equitable plan?
Well,
what do you want Congress to do?
The quote states our position exactly like it is.
I would think so.
Which is good.
I would think so.
I'm glad you're reading that stuff.
That's all right. I have it right here for you. So what is an equitable plan?
We appreciate that. We will continue to work towards equitable policy as it surrounds climate. Right now, we're not focused directly on the climate activity because right now the debate's around energy production, job creation, economic recovery.
Well,
and that's where we're focused.
Local leadership is not going to take up a bill, so you don't have to worry about that.
Well, that's my point. And so what are they talking about today? They're talking about job creation and economic recovery. And that's what we're focused on. We believe we can create hundreds of thousands of new jobs within the oil and gas sector, and we believe that's good public policy. So that's what we're advocating
so
today.
API has not reached the point where you have any details of what you consider to be an equitable plan.
We've got some general framework, I believe, is on our website that you can go to and see the general principles we support.
Give us a
but
couple
we're
of
not
examples.
Aggressively pursuing those.
Give us a couple
That
of
it should be
examples.
equitable across all entities, be it the stationary forms of creating electricity, industrialists who use energy consumption, or the mobile sources. I might add, if you look, the area that we've gotten closely to addressing the climate issue is in the mobile sources with auto efficiency standards, with the renewable fuel standards that have been developed. Those are a couple of the areas that have been taken in efforts to address the climate issue. We haven't gotten there, if you will, on stationary sources and some of the industrials. So we believe those approaches need to be equitable. We need to look at all CO2 emissions and balance those. One of the reasons we took strong exception to the Waxman-Markey bill is they gave all the benefit to the stationary source efforts as well as industrials, and they put all the cost on the mobile sources. So people driving cars were going to be paying for, people driving cars would have been paying for somebody to have an offset in their electricity bill. So it wasn't a fair representation as the cost. It wouldn't change the consumer behavior because you skewed the system. And that's what the Waxman-Markey bill did, in addition to potentially destroying 1 million jobs and driving gasoline prices to $5 a gallon. Poor public policy. That's why we took issue with it. That's why we strongly opposed it, and we went out and we educated the public on the matter.
Okay. I had a question about natural gas and is it hydraulic fracturing. Is that the a lot of concerns raised about the toxicity involved in that process? Is that those serious concerns, major concerns? Should that result in more regulation of the process, or would that be counterproductive?
Well, the hydraulic fracturing process is our ability to develop with modern technology, if you will, energy resources that we really couldn't develop in commercial quantities for many years. The natural gas finds in the United States today, it's a true game changer.
Can I just interrupt for a second? I don't know how many people watching or following might actually know what hydraulic fracturing is. Could you take 60 seconds and explain in as lay language as you can the process, sir?
Hydraulic fracturing is a technology where you drill vertically down significantly, maybe 1.5 miles, and then you turn horizontally and drill out into, say, a seam of natural gas. And when I say a seam, you're in a rock formation. And in these particular cases, you might have, and I'm oversimplifying this, a layer of strata that's down in the earth, mile and a half or so. And within that pocket, you might have small pockets of gas. Well, to make that commercial to develop, you need to really bring those together, if you will. And so fracking is a process when you take the pipe and you put it out there, and then you make a small fracturing effort through an explosion, if you will, and fracture that rock so those little pockets of gas can migrate together to the pipe and then be pulled out and extracted and then used.
Water and fluids are pumped down to essentially break the rock apart.
Yeah, 99.9% of what's pumped down is water under high pressure with sand. And in that sand process, then when you fracture the rock, it holds the rock fracture open, if you will, and allows the grass to migrate. And that's what we call hydraulic fracturing. And because of this technology, we're now able to develop vast resources of clean-burning natural gas in this country. It really is a game changer, as I mentioned earlier. And now when we look at our potential to increase manufacturing jobs in the United States, many of those were lost because of the price of natural gas. We now have well over 100-year reserve in the United States that's been identified, and it could be even much bigger than that. So fracking, though it's been a technology that's been around for some time, we have dramatically improved it, and now we have the ability to develop a resource that we hadn't developed before.
There's concerns raised about the effect on water tables, the aquifers, I guess, in the areas around where that's done, I guess up in the Northeast especially. I know the Times had that big report a couple months ago. How big of a concern is that? Should there be more regulation on that process?
Well, it's a concern that needs to be dealt with, obviously. Currently, it's regulated by state and federal law. But to put that in context, so your viewers and readers will understand, when we drill down about 1.5 miles and then turn, and you know, there's variations on how depth the rock strata is, etc. But the water tables we're talking about here are generally in the first few hundred feet up here on the surface. So when you drill through one of those, you case the well, and I'm simplifying this again, but you take the well casing the pipes, if you will, that you bring down through that water table, and you protect those with cementing operations, etc., so the water table doesn't migrate back and forth into the particular product that you're producing. And we have just developed and produced 5 new standards on those activities as well through our standard setting process. These are all on our website. You can go read them in great detail at api.org. And so we are working with state regulators to take those best practices, to promote them in different jurisdictions within the states, to make sure they have the latest state-of-art regulatory opportunities to manage this process of developing natural gas.
You said casing the well. Were there any lessons learned for hydraulic fracturing from the issues surrounding casing of the well at the Deepwater Horizon rig?
Yeah, we constantly learn and improve over time. And be it a deep water well or be it hydraulic fracturing onshore, we're learning from those processes. Now we get the best minds together as new technologies are developed. We have to review, let me step back. Our standard setting process is certified by independent certifiers who come in to make sure we're transparent. We provide others the opportunity to come contribute to what should this best practice be. And then we use third-party auditors to go out and make sure the practices are being deployed. So be it in deep water wells or be it onshore fracking activities, hydraulic fracturing activities, a lot of these standards cross over, if you will, into basic drilling techniques. So some of the lessons learned, if you will, they'll apply to a lot of different standards in the oil and gas industry. And we change those standards, or we update them at least every 5 years. Most times we'll update them more often than that as new technology comes to the marketplace.
Can you address the concerns from hydraulic fracturing on seismic activity, please?
Well, some have suggested there's some relationship to seismic. To my knowledge, that hasn't been documented. They're still looking at those questions. But again, we're down in the earth, 1.5 miles, 2 miles, whatever the depth of those might be.
But you are, in a way, changing the rock formation, correct?
Well, you're fracturing the rock. That's why they call it fracturing.
Right.
You're making a fracture in
Breaking
that
it.
particular strata.
Right.
And you break it, and then you're able to extract the energy resource that's in those little pockets.
But in some areas,
I'm oversimplifying
right?
this.
Well, sure, but that's been the question raised, because I mean, in areas like North Dakota, where there's a lot of it going on, it's repeated. It's not like it happens once and a whole lot of oil or gas comes out and everybody's done, right? In an area, it can happen hundreds of times.
Oh, we have thousands of wells across the United States.
No, but I mean, how many fracturings could take place in one particular area?
Well, it depends on the way you construct the particular well or that particular footprint. But you'll drill down and you'll move horizontally, and then you'll crack the rock and extract the energy. So, however many drill holes or wells that you put in place, you'd use the technology in those.
Okay. We have time for a couple more questions.
You mentioned politics and demand and all that is affecting oil prices. Do you think speculators affect oil prices?
Well, clearly the markets affect oil prices, and that's why we believe one of the best things we can do is send a signal to the market that the United States is serious about producing their oil and gas, which will contribute to the global supply of oil and gas that's on the marketplace. So yes, just like any other commodity that's produced, there are those that are in the trading business that are trying to project forward what they think that price will be. We believe the one issue we have control over is that supply area, and that by bringing more supply to the marketplace, that can be our best contribution, if you will, to make sure those margins don't get tight between supply and demand, and thus allow others to try to assume what that price might be going forward. We think a strong signal to the marketplace would help. That help is on the way, that we're going to produce America's oil and natural gas, and then the market will eventually settle out.
In the leasing debate, we often hear, well, the oil companies have a whole lot of leases they've never developed, they don't need more. Can you address that?
Absolutely, and thanks for the question. When you think about and this is a lot of the political theater, and it's unfortunate because they're perpetuating myths that aren't founded in fact. As companies, when we go out to secure a lease, we pay millions of dollars for those. We pay millions of dollars every year to hold that lease and to look. Why anyone would suggest that we pay millions of dollars and sit on it, it's silly. It's a silly argument. Let me give you one case in point. Shell has been working in Alaska now for close to 5 years. They have invested over $4 billion to develop a particular lease up there. They're still waiting on government permits to develop this operation. That lease, under the definition that the administration has put forward as inactive, that's what they call that lease. They call it inactive. Why? Because we're waiting on a government permit. It's a little bit like going and renting an apartment, having the landlord refuse to give you the keys and then criticizing you because you haven't occupied the apartment. And that's why this is such a nonsensical argument. It's just, it doesn't contribute in a positive way to the debate.
So would you say that all the unused leases in the Gulf of Mexico are unused because the companies are waiting for permits?
I can tell you those companies who are spending millions of dollars to hold those leases, they're doing everything they can to try to identify oil and natural gas on those leases and to eventually develop them. Many times after we pay millions of dollars for these leases, we turn them back to the government because we don't find any oil and gas. Keep in mind, the government doesn't know where the oil and gas is. They're literally going out and saying, we'll give you that little block of land, you give us millions of dollars for it, good luck. All the risk is on the part of the industry, all the risk is on the part of those that are prepared to invest to go out and see if they can find oil and gas on that lease.
But that really wasn't my question. My question was, do you think that anecdote about Shell in Alaska is typical of all the leases, and I'm speaking of the Gulf because we're in Florida, that are unused at the moment?
Each lease is unique, but let me once again reiterate, when you pay millions of dollars for something, and you pay millions of dollars every year just to hold it, you're highly motivated to develop it and get it to produce.
Sure, but
to suggest we're sitting on those is a bogus argument.
Okay, but the comment is made because in response to the industry's request to open up more areas for leasing. And Senator Nelson of Florida, who has been pretty active on this issue, as I'm sure you know, has said, what do you mean? You've got all these acres of leased area now that you're not drilling on. So why do you need more when these haven't even been drilled on or fully evaluated yet?
Well, there's a variety of reasons, Randy. First, they might be waiting on government permits, just like the Shell example I gave you.
They might be.
That's hardly, well, I can't tell you they're all waiting on a government permit. Maybe it's 99% of them that are waiting on government permits.
Well, you don't have it. You don't really know.
Well, what we do know is that the industry is highly motivated, having spent millions of dollars to secure that lease, to go out and to produce on that lease. And anybody that suggests otherwise doesn't understand the industry or is making a bogus political argument.
Well, wouldn't you have a better argument back if you could say we have X many acres of leased sea area now, Gulf area, whatever you want to call it, and this percentage is not being used yet for this reason, this isn't being used for this reason, because it sounds as though you really don't know why they're not using them at the moment.
No, it varies. It varies. You might have some that are out there still doing seismic. Some might not know what is on their lease. So there are various stages of this process. Once you secure the lease, you then have to go get a permit to go out and look, and you have to do environmental assessments and the rest of it to say, do we have oil and gas on this lease or don't we? Then from there, if you find it, then you've got to prove it up to find out wells and in commercial quantities that we could actually develop this quantity of oil and gas. So each of these leases is really unique. I give you the Shell example as one anecdotal example to show why the argument doesn't hold up. That they're saying that some leases are idle when the industry is aggressively doing everything they can to produce, and it's on the government side to decide if they have that opportunity.
No, what you've done is cite that in the case of one lease, not the others.
Well, if you'd like a complete list of all the leases, Randy, we'd be happy to sit down with you and try to walk you through every one of these to show you
at the heart of the debate over opening up more land in the Gulf closer to Florida.
No, I think it's an uninformed political head fake to distract people from the real issues. Is what it is.
Okay.
said the U.S. should send this
Last question.
to the market, and Congressman Markey wants the U.S. to prepare to use its reserves. Do you think that that is the signal that we should send, or is that a wise idea or not?
Well, when you say reserves, or what?
Strategic Petroleum Reserve.
Okay. We really haven't taken a position on whether they should use oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve or not in terms of prices. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve was originally established for a crisis in terms of supply interruptions, etc. So from our standpoint, that's a decision that needs to be made by government officials. But when you use the word reserves, we do believe that we should look at American reserves outside the SPRO. We absolutely think we should be developing those resources, and we believe that's the even stronger message that goes to the market. That the United States is serious about developing oil and natural gas in this country, and that the public policy will allow us to do that in the future, because it creates hundreds of thousands of jobs, generates billions of dollars to the federal treasury, and makes us less reliant on outside sources.
Mr. Gerard, thank you for visiting.
Thank you, Randy. It's great to be here.